I'm Alex Haugland.
And I'm Amy Haugland.
And this is our 1959 MG Magnette ZB Varitone.
Welcome to
Everyday to Exotic.
Tell me, baby, where do you go when you dream? Oh, baby, where do you go when you dream?
There's over 200 cars in the Haugland Collection.
And it just keeps growing.
Our goal is to try and drive them all.
Each episode, we'll talk about the car's history, showcase its design and features, and dive into its mechanicals.
Then we'll take it out on a drive through the beautiful roads of Oregon.
Finally, we'll rate our car to see where it stands in the Haugland rank.
In this episode,
our car has been covered in chickens.
Amy has aesthetic opinions.
Nobody wants that, trust me.
Alex describes that MG style.
It just reeks of Britishness.
It does reek of Britishness.
All this and more on today's episode of Everyday to Exotic.
But first, let's take a look into the car's history. MG was founded as a subsidiary of Morris Motors in the United Kingdom, building performance-oriented cars in the 1920s. Following World War II, and with their successful entry into the US market with cars like the MG TC, the Morris Motor Company ended up merging with their British competitor Austin in 1952 to form the British Motor Corporation Limited, better known as BMC, becoming the largest British car manufacturer of its day, with Austin becoming the dominant partner in the merger.
Under the BMC branding, technologies of the two companies was shared across the marques. This introduced the Austin-developed B-Series engine to the MG lineup, which came to become the standard engine for most of the cars until 1980.
Our MG Magnette ZB Varitone came out of those developments. The Magnette name had been used by MG since the 1930s as one of the three main model designations the company used for their standard lineup. Midget was used for the smallest of the cars, including the MGP and T-Series, such as the MGTC we did an episode on earlier. On the other end of the scale, Magna, with the F and L type, was the largest, with a 6-cylinder engine. Finally, Magnette, with the N and K type, was in between the two as a mid-level model.
Almost immediately after the merger forming BMC, the Magnette name was revived in 1954, this time as MG's first monocoque or unibody car, and only as a 4-door saloon. The first version was the ZA Magnette. The body of the Magnette was partly shared with the Wolseley 4/44, which premiered 1 year earlier but only had a 1250cc engine versus the MG's 1.5-liter variant. In 1956, the ZA was succeeded by the ZB, with minor changes between the cars, mostly being engine upgrades giving the car more power. In 1957, the last change to the Z-Series Magnette was introduced with the ZB Varitone, which featured a larger rear window, different trim on the body, and optional 2-color paintwork.
Our car is an example of an MG Magnette ZB Varitone built in 1958. It was purchased secondhand in California in 1962 and owned for most of its existence by Page Smith, a professor of history at the University of California, Los Angeles, then Santa Cruz, and founding provost of Haugland College at UC Santa Cruz. He's also an author of over 20 books, mostly focused on American history, including The Chicken Book, about the role that chickens have played in history, culture, and society. The car then passed to his daughter and through a couple of other owners before we acquired it in 2017.
When we bought the car, it was complete and generally solid, but a relatively tired example. Under our ownership, we have restored the car and upgraded it both in drivetrain as well as in other ways to improve its drivability in modern conditions, and to be what we felt was the best example of what the car could be while preserving the unique character of this historic automobile.
Not a care in the world as you watch me fly.
So the styling of the MG Magnette is really indicative of the transition that was happening in MG and in car design in Britain in general at that time. At the same time that this car was being designed, MG was still producing like the MG TD and other cars that still looked like pre-war cars that had upright radiators, side-opening bonnets, sort of all of those traditional details that you tend to associate with pre-war cars. Here we still have that upright grille. You still have a bonnet that kind of has the same shape, although this one opens from the back. We have the fenders kind of sitting lower than the bonnet, but they're integrated into the body. So we are starting to move into that more modern car shape. And that was a big departure for MG, honestly. This is a unibody car. That was another massive departure for MG, because before this, everything was mounted to a frame. And even after this, the MGA, which was a contemporary production car to this, had a frame underneath it. It wasn't really until the MGB that the main sports car line of MGs started actually going unibody, like this did in 1953.
Let's talk about some details of this particular car and this particular model. This is a Varitone. That doesn't just mean that it has two colors. Originally, this car was black on black. That's the way it was ordered. However, the birch gray was an option, and we decided that looked nicer. One of the reasons for getting the Varitone, even if you wanted an all-black car, is it has more chrome trim pieces. So this line that comes down the side of the car, that's strictly for the Varitone. Another thing that I love about this car while we're up front is you see all the MG octagons. MG loves octagons. They love to put them everywhere. We talked a little bit about that with the MGTC. On this one, the radiator cap is an octagon. You, of course, have the MG badge, which is an octagon. And we're going to see more octagons as we continue going through the car.
I will also add, this radiator cap doesn't really do anything. It's purely decorative. It's to really cast back to that idea of the pre-war styled cars. The fog lights and the driving lights were standard, and this car had both of them when we acquired it.
I do love how it's mounted onto the overriders. It's just like, it harkens back to when the lights were in separate pods. So you still have that kind of callback while it's still modern and integrated into the car.
You'll notice that we still have actually a European style front plate mount on this car. This we did not restore when we restored the car. And the reason why is this sticker here, the UC Santa Cruz sticker that belonged to Page Smith when he owned this car. And so that is part of the history of the car, and I didn't want to lose it. I could have replaced this entire piece, I could have done away with it completely, but it is part of the history of the car, so it stays.
While we're up here, I do want to talk about a couple of little details on the hood, because I just think it's beautiful. I mean, the beauty is functional for the most part, but I just love the fact that they took the time to make it pretty. So these are the bonnet hinges, which stick through the top. That's really unusual. I love that sort of teardrop shape and the fact that they're not body colored, they're chrome. So it's like they call attention to themselves. I also love this curve that goes all the way around, and it goes around this, which may look a little odd to you, but Alex is going to demonstrate. There we go.
It's a fresh air vent coming into the car.
Obviously, this doesn't have air conditioning, so that lets a little fresh air in to make the compartment more comfortable.
We get our hubcaps with our octagonal MG badges in the middle of it over a steel wheel. That was pretty much standard on these cars, and it's almost an identical wheel to what they're putting on the MG TD at the time. Behind that wheel originally would have been a drum brake. In this case, we've got discs.
MG's motto was safety fast. We're living up to that motto better than they did originally.
Yeah. One of the other things I love on the chrome trim here is this strip here that the handles integrate into. And so the handles basically flow in that line from the front to the back, as well as the chrome that goes around the gutter molding. Any rainwater that comes down on the roof channels it to the front and back, so it's not dripping down over the doors.
You do get that effect that I've mentioned on other cars before of a piece of jewelry framed in metal.
One other change that came on the later Magnettes is here. This chrome cover here covers over what originally would have been a semaphore trafficator slot. And so originally your turn signal would have been a semaphore trafficator that popped out and lit up, coming out of a slot right here on the car. By this point, they'd pretty much abandoned that. Your rear turn signals flashed like any modern car, and no longer did you have little pop-up semaphores. I kind of miss them. They're fun, but at the same point, most people don't know what the heck they are.
A neat detail as we're heading toward the back is the way that the rear fender sort of continues into the door. That curve bulges right there as if it's going over the wheel. and it's fits into where the actual fender is. It's nice that it sort of breaks up that solid black on the side of the car. And again, it works to not have the car be really flat.
And it helps hide the door a little bit.
A little bit, yeah. I also like how the chrome follows that line down to the very back bumper.
So the fuel door on this is key operated. You have to have a key to get in. Otherwise, it's a pretty straightforward thing.
Also note that the fuel door is not flat. It also is shaped to fit the curve of the body pretty seamlessly.
So one other detail on these cars, and typical of a lot of British cars of this time, is you have this down here, this hole underneath the car. That is your jacking point that your jack would fit into that would allow you to basically raise this entire side of the car with a single jack. So if you had to change a spare tire on the side of the road, theoretically that's what you would do. The downside is if your jack tips, it usually tips into the body of the car, and now you've damaged both doors. So I usually don't use it. On to the back of the car.
Yes. You'll notice, of course, front and center is yet another octagon.
With the MG logo in it.
With the MG logo in it, because they don't want you to forget it's an MG. Again, fairly simple back here. I like the bumpers. These are the, nice 50 style bumpers with the little overriders. Regular old license plate mount back here.
I particularly like the taillight design.
Oh, me too.
And this is a pretty common Lucas lamp, but in a larger size than you tend to see on other cars. I like the odd little fins it has, but it's just a little pod that basically sticks off the back of the car. So pretty nice, elegant little design. Doesn't seem out of place, seems very 1950s.
Yes.
This, you have not only your license plate lights up underneath here, but this is also a backup light. So when you shift into reverse, it actually shines out. This chrome piece over the top of it is something unique to the Magnette. The light fixture underneath it is actually something that you find on like Jaguars and other cars of the era. They pretty much hid almost all of it though from sight. It looks really nice on the Jaguars, and it's what they used on like license plates on the XK120 and things like that. But for here, it's almost completely hidden.
So while we're back here, one of the big, literally and figuratively, features of the Varitone Magnette is this rear window. It's bigger on the Varitone. And originally, the car bodies were the same between the Varitone and the base model. They actually modified it afterwards in order to put the bigger window in for this type.
The trunk itself is actually pretty spacious. We've got a latch under here that you just pull, and then it goes up and it holds itself open, which is a really nice feature to have, as opposed to like fiddling with props and whatever I'm trying to put in the trunk at the same time.
And that's not very usual for the 50s, is it?
No. A lot of them you would have a prop, you'd have something you had to deal with in order to basically hold the trunk open. So this is actually a higher end car than a lot of the other cars kind of coming out at the time. Back here, you've got a huge amount of space. There's a lot of room in here. There are multiple cases of wine, especially if you wanted to even stack them, because you could have basically about 4 deep without any problem. And then you could probably go up another layer high. So huge amount of wine.
So like
And
6,
still room for a spare.
7?
Probably about 8, I would think.
8 cases? And the spare is nicely out of the way.
Yep.
I mean, it's not awkward to deal with at all.
Yep. So other thing back here is still typical of cars of the era, is a starting handle. And so this allows you, when your starter dies, to hand crank the engine and get it to fire. Which technically, even with having modified this engine, you can still do, because we left the crank dog mounted to the front of the engine. We opted to texture the inside of the trunk as a way of finishing it. It needed some rust repair when we got the car, which we did. It was just a good solution to kind of make it usable without really getting too deep into it. Closing the trunk, just push down.
Another good solid thunk.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take you through the mechanicals of this car, as well as everything that we did in our Restomod conversion. So pull the latch for the hood, and I can come over here and raise it up. The original hood prop is here, which does prop the hood up, but doesn't give you a great view. So I'm going to fix that. So now we can really get into the mechanicals of this, and most of what makes this a Restomod and not just another MG Magnette ZB Varitone. We went out of our way to be very sympathetic in this Restomod to not overly change things we didn't have to change. We easily could have put a completely different engine in here or something that didn't really fit. Instead, what we opted for is this is a 1.8 liter engine out of an MGB. It's not the 3-main engine like the early MGBs. We actually ended up going with the 5-main, which gives you a stronger motor, a little bit more durability, but added some complexities in order to actually get it in this car. One of the big differences is the oil pan. The oil pan on the MG Magnette mounts in the opposite direction as far as where the sump and the pickup are from how it mounted on the MGB. To fit this, we had to use the pickup and oil pan off of the Magnette engine. But the problem with that is the 5-main doesn't have the mountings for the pickup. So we have an adapter plate in between that manages to sandwich everything together and gets everything to line up and help sort out the fact that the bolt holes didn't quite line up, things like that. With a little bit of work, you can actually get the engine in. We also went with the later carburetors. The originals are H4 carburetors. They're made by SU. The problem with the H4 carburetors is they have a nasty habit of leaking over time. We went with the later HS4s as what was on the MGB. So we fitted those instead. You can't easily tell other than the way that the fuel bowls are done. They look a bit different if you know what you're looking at. The downside is that also meant that our throttle linkage and everything didn't quite line up. So in the back here, we fitted a flexible joint to essentially make what originally was a straight rod connect up at a slight offset. We also put in an electronic ignition system, so no points. All of that makes it more reliable. I can hop in the car, I can drive it reliably. It's also a very nice system. This is another Ignition 123 distributor that I can actually tune and make it tuned exactly to how the engine is performing. Otherwise, we tried to keep everything looking the same. So the air filter is the original air filter off of the Magnette engine. Fortunately, the diameter of the carburetors and the mounting of the air intake on the carburetors is identical between the two different carburetor types that we had. So we were able to reuse the original air filter and kind of keep the same appearance. This originally was an oil bath air filter. We put a paper filter in it, so it breathes a little bit easier. It's not quite as messy to change. Originally, you would like put your used motor oil in there or whatever to catch all of the dust and dirt because it would suck all the air through that oil. Kind of a nasty thing to deal with, and paper filters are much, much easier to manage. Radiator is the original radiator. Our radiator cap is underneath. The one in the hood is the dummy, and everything else is pretty much as is. We modernized this car. One thing we didn't touch, other than putting a brand new wiring harness in it, is the Lucas electrics. This car is basically still as they originally designed it as far as all the wiring. We only have our 2 fuses here, as they did originally. We have a regulator here that does nothing because we have an alternator on this as opposed to the generator. That actually came on the car when I got it. It was already installed. Otherwise, I probably would have put on an alternator that was in a generator body so it would actually look like the original. I may go back and do that at some point in time, but not really much incentive to do it yet. Otherwise, all the bits and pieces are pretty much as this car was originally designed. It helps kind of keep the aesthetic the way that it was intended, and I actually don't find Lucas Electrics to be that bad as long as you don't mess with them and as long as everything's a clean, solid connection to begin with. And putting a new wiring harness solved that. The other reason to put a new wiring harness is that always what ends up happening is that the braiding over the cables and things like that just disintegrates over time. And so it looks ugly. If there's braiding over the wires, you can't tell what any of the wires are. It really helps a lot to just start fresh, start from scratch, and reset the whole thing. And that's what we did. So sort of your typical British Lucas Electrics car. The wipers aren't amazing. This is actually your wiper motor. It basically oscillates and drives or pushes a geared cable in and out of this tube that runs up to each of the wiper wheel boxes. And as it pushes it and pulls it, it basically causes the arms to move on the wiper. They're always slow, they're always bad. There's no real good upgrade to them, unfortunately, that I know of. If you've got one, I'd be interested in hearing. But otherwise, it is the original wiper setup on the car. It does work as well as it ever did in the 1950s. Other major changes here, as far as performance and things like that, are a 5-speed gearbox. It's a gearbox out of a Ford Sierra, a European car. A car that never really was sold here in the United States other than as the XR4 Ti, which we never got very many of. That gearbox is a Ford T9 gearbox. It's a great fit for these engines as far as the gear ratios. It works really well. And there's a company out of the UK that makes a kit to put it on B series engines. And fortunately, it works for the Magnette as well. So that fixed most of our problems with this car. As far as going down the road and having it scream at you at 55 miles an hour, turning 4,000 RPM or whatever it was, it actually allows us to have that overdrive gear at the end and drop those RPMs to something fairly reasonable. The original gear ratio in the rear differential here was also 4.55 to 1, which is part of what makes it pull off the line fairly nicely with a smaller engine, even with the weight of the car and everything, but it's also part of what makes it absolutely miserable to drive above 55 miles an hour. So we swapped that out. Instead of to the 3.9 that was used in the MGB, because this is a heavier car, we wanted to still stay with a little bit more of a gear ratio that biased towards the heavier weight of the car. We went with a 4.1 to 1 ratio. So that really is the sum of what we changed on the main driveline. Other than that, the major changes are disc brakes on the front, which are basically MGB disc brakes fitted to this. That means that your stopping's a lot better on the front. Your rear axle, like an MGB, is still drum brakes. The suspension on the front is a double-arm suspension setup, which unusually for a British car happens to use tube shocks. The rear is a solid axle mounted on leaf springs. Pretty basic, more or less the same suspension as what was under the MGA, not that different from the suspension that was under the MG T-Series either, for that matter. Steering is rack and pinion, which is part of why it's so precise and works really well. Location of the cross member is why the oil pan is different between this and an MGB or MGA motor. So the one thing I really wish I could do on this car would be fit air conditioning. It's theoretically doable, but it's not very easy because there's really nowhere to put anything around the radiator because of the way that this brace and everything is made. And that brace is what latches your hood shut. So without doing some major redesigning or trying to come up with some creative way of doing it, can't really put air conditioning in this. I'd love to, but it's a lot more work and not necessarily going to be worth it at the end of everything. And it would probably require changing far more about the car than I really want to. Overall, a really nicely set up car once you get it done right. Absolutely a joy to drive. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy to guide everyone through the interior of this car. But as I do that, I will open the door and show one of the things I love about it, which is that the door opens almost to a full 90 degrees.
Makes it very easy for someone like me in a skirt to get in and out. So, hopefully you can see me. I did not think about my shirt today, and so I am color matched to our beautiful interior. This interior is the original color, but it is not the original interior. It was originally red. When we got the car, the interior was black. Black, as we know, is boring, and so we decided to take it back to the red. Also, both of us really like red, so, good excuse. The interior style, again, not original, but for the most part, period correct. We have made a few modifications. So let's start with the dash. We had the dash completely redone and refinished. It is wood, which is the way it would have been in the original car. MG steering wheel, you know this because there's a giant MG octagon on it. This is the turn signal, which throws me off a little bit sometimes, which you will probably see on the drive. This is the horn. Don't have to have the ignition on to do that, which is nice. Other controls and gauges up here are fairly standard. You've got your fuel, your oil, your temperature, etc. Speedometer is in miles. Yay! This was originally an American market car. However, the British also do miles, so that makes me very happy. So we have knobs that are helpfully labeled with the first letter of what they do, like W is for wiper, not Wonder Woman, L is for lights, P is for panel lights, F is for fog, etc., etc., etc. We have heater controls over here, warm, cold, demist, etc. One of the cool things is you have this knob that has a B on it, and that's your blower motor. And you pull it out to turn it on, push it in to turn it off. One of the fun things about the dashboard is it looks as it would have in the 50s. You could get a radio as an option, and then this is the original speaker. This is the wood panel that would be over your radio spot if you didn't get a radio. However, we have done a little upgrading. So we have a radio. It is hidden. It is modern. The only other sign of that modern radio is that we did put speakers in the parcel shelf area down here. The covers for those speakers, the grills, are from a E-type so that we preserve the period look so it's not like black plastic down there. Nobody wants that, trust me. So the lever to open up that vent that we opened up earlier is right here under the dash, and you just push it forward into this sort of divot here, and then you pull it back up, close it. Also down here we have an ashtray because it's the 1950s and we all smoke. So we used up most of the parcel shelf for speakers, but there is just a little bit left, and it's the perfect place to put your knitting. So along with the parcel shelf, you actually do get a glove box. Just a little handle here, pull down. It's actually pretty roomy. You can put quite a bit of stuff in here. Many, many gloves. Standard pedal setup with your gas and your brake and your clutch, and then that knob down there, you can push it with your foot, and that's your dimmer switch. One very subtle difference that tells you about some of the changes that we made to the mechanicals, as Alex mentioned earlier, is the fact that this knob has a 5-speed shift pattern. We talked about how we changed to a 5-speed transmission from the 4-speed. Otherwise, this knob is exactly the same shape and color and everything as the original shift knob. So that was a nice little thing that Alex found. The seats are adjustable, forward and back. There's a lever, and then they move on rails. Also, this car has seat belts. Did not originally have seat belts. However, safety fast, but not too fast. An important feature in this car is the clock. There is a clock above the rearview mirror, and it works. So, you know, that's kind of cool. And the doors are kind of fancy, other than the fact that they open almost 90 degrees. You have that beautiful wood panel with the chrome trim here, and that continues along the side of the door, including the chrome. So you have your door latch, roll down windows, your little triangle windows. And then you have these. These are handmade door pulls. And I know that they're handmade because Alex made them. The old ones were pretty dead, and I wouldn't depend on them to pull to close the door. So Alex bought the materials and actually remade door pulls to look like the originals. So here we are in the nice roomy back seat. There's a couple features that I just want to emphasize back here. I love the curve. I just think that's really awesome. Features. You know, it always makes me laugh. Ashtrays in the back as well, because you might be hauling friends and they may need to smoke. Is the 1950s. The other cool thing is if you have children back here and you're tired of them poking each other, and say, no, stay on your side. But it's also very, you know, very cool. That's just very nicely fitted. I love this leather tab thing. There you go, when you don't need it. One last detail while we're back here. One of my favorite things about this car is that most of the materials in the interior are not man-made. Both the headliner and the carpet are wool. The seats are leather. The wood is actually wood. All of those things lend themselves to kind of the luxury feel of a car that isn't huge. It's not a Bentley, but you kind of get that Bentley feel. Also, that means that you're comfortable no matter where you sit.
When we first got this car, it was a running, driving car, but it was really, really tired. I mean, the engine was having a little bit of issues. The valves had kind of receded into the head due to the fact that we'd been running on unleaded fuel for years. A lot of work needed to kind of happen to it. And so it was a cool car. I loved this thing. I love the way these things look. But driving it was kind of miserable. largely because of the gearing and the way the engine was set up and things like that. It just basically didn't have the ability to drive at speed very well. You hit higher PMs, it was just really loud and obnoxious, and at the same time, you weren't going that fast.
Not set up for modern traffic.
Yeah, very much not. It probably was a great car in England, where your top speed is maybe 50 miles an hour in most places. Even at 55 on backcountry highways, like we tend to like to drive, the engine was screaming, and it was really quite loud. A lot of the changes we made, though, were to really improve that driving experience, and I think it really has. It has better gearing, it's got a more powerful engine.
We made it a happier car.
Absolutely.
Not just, for us for the driving experience, but also the car is straining much less now.
Far less.
It's much happier just going down the road, and you don't feel like you're stressing the car out.
Yeah. So we've improved a lot of the handling and the feel of this also because it's now a 5-speed. At the same time, we changed the final drive ratio. It's much more in line with modern traffic. And between those, this car still has reasonable power to have good acceleration, especially with the engine upgrade. But then also with the 5-speed, it's much more comfortable driving at higher speeds. I've driven this on interstates without a problem. It'll go 70 miles an hour without too much issue. The steering on this is for the steering rack. It's nice and precise. The suspension's pretty good. Basically, the engine in this originally was more or less the same engine as what was in the MGA. Now this one's got an MGB motor, so it's bigger displacement, more power. We went with the 5-main, so it's a bit stronger. I mean, a 3-main engine like what was originally in here probably would have been easier to stay with, to be honest, than the 5-main we put in. But, why not? If we're going to do it, let's do it. Let's go all out.
Yes.
I mean, one of my favorite cars that we have is a Jaguar Mark II, and this is like a 3/4 scale version of that car. It's kind of everything I love about the Mark II. It has the wood dash, it's pretty, it's got a nice shape, it's quintessentially British. It just, reeks of Britishness.
It does reek of Britishness.
And
in the most charming way possible.
Absolutely. This kind of has all of those things that I love about the Mark II as a 4-door family car. I mean, US it's a sedan, Britain it's a saloon. British cars, they tend to use British phrases, so hey, that's the way it works.
It's important to speak the car's native tongue.
Yes. I mean, it's got a bonnet and a boot.
But it hasn't got a hood because it's not a convertible.
Exactly. I mean, 4-door MGs in the United States are almost non-existent. Most people only know MGs for MGBs and just roadsters and little sports cars. This is intended to be kind of an executive car when in the UK, or a family car one way or the other. And you just didn't really see them here, so it's rare to see them turning up at all. I was looking for one when this came up and took the opportunity to buy it. I knew full well that as long as it was a running driving car, I could make it a better running driving car. And finding one that was done the way I wanted to was basically impossible. It made sense to kind of tackle this as a project and buy it to be sort of a project. And I'm glad I had a chance to drive it ahead of time because that really let me know sort of what worked, what didn't on the car itself. And we have a lot of the ownership history on this, which is a big part of what makes this car also interesting.
And I love it when we can get things like family photos. We have a couple of cars that are like, yeah, this is my dad or my grandpa, and with the car on this trip that we took a lot of the time, or in front of our house.
I love that. I love the history of the car, the unique car itself, not just the history of the mark or history of the model, but also just the history of who owned it, when, and sort of who they were.
Yes. So, here we are. This is so fun. I love this car. Okay, I love all the cars, but this car in particular is just fun. I love how little it is. And yet it, you can put 4 people in here. I feel like this would be an excellent daily driver with all the mods that we've done to it.
Yeah.
Before the mods, no. But after the mods, I think it's delightful. It's not a big car. doesn't weigh very much. I don't have any problems getting this thing around. The steering is pretty precise. I can turn corners very easily. I'm not concerned really at all. This car is truly a pleasure to drive, and I really like the fact that both Alex and I can drive it comfortably.
Yeah, which is actually not that common for a lot of our cars.
No.
Is that the driving position one way or the other tends not to work very well for one or the other of us.
Yeah, one of us is usually making some kind of compromise. But with this little guy, no, not a problem. I do love the Britishness of this car. I mean, there is a trunk load of Britishness between the wood details and the way the steering wheel is, and everything is very tidy in this car. And part of that is that we have restored it. It feels like it's been restored properly. It's a proper car.
When you do a Restomod especially,
Yes.
or when you do any upgrade on the car, you need to think about the car as a whole.
Yes.
And I feel that we did a good job on this car doing that, picking just sort of exactly what was right. All of that really does help as it kind of comes together and culminates to make what otherwise would be a entertaining and interesting car to drive great.
Yes. So one of the things that I love about this car is that it's so easy to shift gear to gear, including downshifting, which I normally hate doing.
I mean, it is a gearbox from the 1980s, so that makes it a hell of a lot easier compared to like the original 1950s gearbox that was in this.
It's a very good point.
It also means you get a synchro in first gear, which you didn't have previously.
Oh, I like that. I like that very much. The clutch pedal is easy. It's not soft, as it were, but it's not like, oh my gosh, I have to like not skip leg day, as it were, in order to get it to operate. It's also very forgiving. I'm in fifth at the moment, and I am occasionally having to slow down, speed up again, and it's not lagging or doing anything unhappy. And it doesn't brake super fast. The brakes are good, but you need to pay attention and get on them probably a little sooner than you would in a modern car.
They're not boosted. You don't have some of the advantages you have with a modern car. I mean,
Yes.
They're pretty good, but you really do need to push that pedal.
Yes, but this car in particular requires some attention. And I actually kind of like that. It's more interactive.
Yes.
That's something that I really like about classic cars.
Driving them is an experience.
Yes,
It doesn't just take you from A to B. It's the joy of the journey.
yes. It's just happy making. It's like, hey, you know, life is good. I'm just gonna drive through the countryside, past the sheep and the fields and the gray skies, no raining. I feel like I could take this pretty much anywhere. And it does feel like the kind of car you could totally go to the opera in and feel, you know, spiffy about it. There are cars that are fun yet tiring, and this car is just fun. Well, here we are back in the studio after a very stereotypically Oregonian day for driving. And now it's time for the Haugland Score.
Here's how it works.
Alex and I have individually rated the car in 5 categories, each with a rank of 0 to 10. Then we add our scores together to give us the final Haugland Score.
After we combine our scores, the results go up on the board. As we get in the scores, one little caveat. Our scores are based on this car as we have modified it, not necessarily Magnettes in general. So for a lot of this, it's going to be something where we're representing how this car is to drive as part of this collection. So if you have another Magnette, if you do all the same things we do, it'll probably be similar. But otherwise, take it with a grain of salt.
Please remember that a classic Magnette does not drive the same way as our Restomod Magnette.
That said, first score is performance. And for performance, I gave the car a 7. The engine is a significant upgrade over what the original engine was in this car. The only thing that I think is a bit of a downside is it doesn't quite have the handling, honestly, of a more pure sports car. And at the same time, it is heavier than like an MGB, which would have very similar suspension, very similar brakes, very similar engine.
I had so much fun. I gave it a 9. I felt like the steering was precise. I felt like it braked well. I had enough acceleration, but it didn't feel squirrely. The experience, the performance of the car suited me very well.
I mean, honestly, for a four-door car from 1950s, it drives really well.
It does. Okay, so for style, I gave it an 8. I feel like the balance of chrome to paint is beautiful. I love the two-tone aspect of it. It has really nice lines. I feel cool when I'm in it. And also the interior is very clean, very nice, and the color is really cool. So
I also gave it an 8, and a lot of that is, I love how very 1950s British it is. It has just a lot of that beauty and elegance that the Brits put into these cars. That, to me, is a huge part of it. I also love the fact that it's a duotone now, although it was originally just all black. I really love it in the two colors, and that was an original style of paint job, so it counts for me for style.
great.
Next is drivability. And this was really the main thing that was a problem with the Magnette when we first got it. Everything we did, for the most part, modifying this, was to improve drivability above all else. And I think that we succeeded there. And I'd actually give this car an 8 for drivability. It's not perfect, but it's pretty dang good.
And I would also give it an 8. And a lot of that is, I would happily drive that every day.
Oh yeah.
I would park it anywhere, you can go grocery shopping in it, and I'm not worried about it getting damaged.
And you can carry 4 people comfortably. You can
Yes.
carry a lot of wine in the trunk.
Yes, you can.
You can, I mean, important things.
Or luggage.
And with the changes in the gearbox, the final drive ratio and everything, it goes down the freeway beautifully.
And it's happy doing it.
Yes.
Okay, so for significance, I was a little less generous. I gave it a 5. This particular car is very significant among Magnettes, especially given its individual history, but I don't feel like it's as significant in the greater car world.
I can agree in many ways. I gave it a 6, and the reason I kind of went above the average of a 5, it is the first unibody MG. It is also the first MG to feature that B-Series engine. And so those are the two things that to me really make it stand out. Other than that, it's probably one of the most forgotten MGs, especially in the United States. I mean, people like seeing a 4-door MG, it's an unusual thing, but no one knows that it exists.
Yes.
And so for delight, I gave it a 7. A lot of people find it a really interesting car because of the styling, because of the two-tone, because it's a 4-door MG. So I think that's one of the real strengths for it. But at the same time, it doesn't have quite the cachet as, say, the Lamborghini Espada or something like that.
And I gave it an 8. I loved every minute of it, and I love looking at it, and I think it's a fantastic car. And other people react positively to it, but it is a little bit more, what is that? I didn't know a 4-door MG existed. Rather than, oh, that's so cool. I was so taken with it. Other people are slightly taken with it.
Yeah. Okay, that gives us a final score of 74 points for our 1958 MG Magnette ZB Varitone. That puts it in 8th place, just behind our 2005 Morgan Arrow 8, and just a half point above our 1986 Porsche 944 Turbo. That feels like about the right place for the car, in my opinion. I mean, it's not quite as high performance as the Arrow 8, but in a lot of ways, it's a much more practical car than certainly the Arrow 8, and in some ways, even more than the 944 Turbo. It actually seems a fair score.
I feel that way too, and I feel like that's a good ranking within the cars that we've driven so far.
Yeah, it's all subjective, so it doesn't really matter. So the points don't count. But
And we didn't do it this time, but we have talked about in the future starting to do half points, generally outside of car clashes. And so we're going to see more of that gradation. It's amazing how some of these are just really close.
with that, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday to Exotic. Please like, subscribe, follow us on Instagram, follow us on our website. We've got a lot more coming up, and welcome to the new season.
Don't forget to tell your friends.
Okay.
Okay, see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.